Okay. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Subramanian, infectious disease consultant at Gleneagles Global Hospital. Hi, Nambi, you're back.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I suddenly had a technical glitch here. And a very good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to the sixth COVID webinar series. And this is our third webinar series. And we have come to the last lecture of this edition. And we've had debates in the initial 3 sessions for this third edition. And then what we have here is a lineup of 3 lectures of 15 minutes duration, and all of our are really practical sessions. The first one would be on healthcare worker exposure to COVID positive patients. How do you assess risk? What do we do? And for that, we have Dr. Subramanian Swaminathan, who is an infectious disease consultant at Global Gleneagles at Chennai, and who is our ex-secretary of our society, the Clinical Infectious Disease Society. And right now he's doing an ID fellowship training program at global hospitals, and that would be of interest to medicine postgraduates. And the second lecture would be on the appropriate use of personal protective equipments. And for that, we have Dr. Rajalakshmi, who is an ID physician at KIMS Hospital, Trivandrum. She's my friend, and she's a very passionate and enthusiastic ID physician. And she is actively involved in the infection control and probably a key figure in the ID world of Kerala, along with her colleagues, Dr. Sharik and Dr. Arvind from Trivandrum. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Rajiv Soman. And he gave the same lecture on our first edition, which was very popular on diagnosis of COVID. And I've requested again him to give the updates in terms of the diagnostics. Rajiv Soman is one of the pioneers in the world of infectious disease training in India. He, along with Apollo Hospitals Chennai and CMC Vellore, are the most recognized or well-recognized ID training centers in India. And probably most of the ID physicians in Maharashtra and Gujarat have come just because of him, and there's been an exemplary service in terms of human resource creation from Dr. Rajiv Soman. And so we have 3 eminent speakers, dear viewers, and each will be of 15 minutes duration, and probably we'll have some 10 minutes of questions. If at all, if there is any interesting questions, we'll do it at the end. And this is off to Dr. Subramanian Swaminathan to start his first lecture.
Thanks, Nabi. Better you be the secretary for now. So I'm done being secretary. All right. So let's just share the presentation and move on. Right. So I've been tasked with assessing what to do when you have a healthcare worker who's exposed. Now, obviously, okay. So I assume everybody can see the slide. So my list of disclosures. So this was this morning's headline. It's not to pick on any one institution, but when I was looking for something about healthcare worker infection, this was what popped up this morning. So I decided to run with it, and so it's a problem. The first thing is to accept that it's a problem, and also assess why it's happening. And it's interesting if you look at it. The group which is the most vocal is often the least likely to acquire healthcare generated infection. So it's 2 faculty, 10 residents. Let me see the rest of this block. Okay, 26 nurses, 9 technicians, 5 mess workers, 49 attendants, and 34 sanitation workers, and 69 security guards. So obviously it's disproportionately involving various sections of the working community. And at least what they have said is that it's all exclusively due to community-driven infections. Again, I don't have the original data, but I suspect that many hospitals would have problems like this, if not now, at least going forward. So, in general, first thing, infection is inevitable. We are in a pandemic. It's sweeping the place, and it's going to happen. I mean, does that mean that everybody is going to get infection? No. But the majority of us are likely to get infected sometime or the other. And that is, while it's unfortunate, I'm worried that it's just inevitable. Community transmission is rising. I'm not going to go into the politics of it or the phases of it and things like that. But let's just accept that more and more of our patients have infection coming from the community and not from a traceable positive person. And in a Dutch cohort, what they showed was within 2 weeks of the first patient being positive with COVID in the Netherlands, healthcare workers started testing positive. So which basically means that infection in healthcare happens fairly early after the detection of infection in the community for an infection like this. And they also showed, another Dutch study also showed, the SECAMAS group, which is still being peer reviewed, suggests that introduction, it seems from the community, they did genetic diversity analysis and things like that, and they said there were multiple clades, which makes the suggestion that they are all introduction from the community and probably not a nosocomial spread. So yes, good infection control practices would prevent nosocomial transmission, but having said that, when community transmission is high, it's going to be difficult. And this is important. I know there are numerous queries. I've had a lot of questions being asked of me about testing of staff. I'm running a stem cell transplant unit. I'm running this oncology unit. I'm running all kinds of things. I want to do PCR for all my staff. The staff today, there are no guidelines which suggest routine testing of the staff, and I've gone through a lot, including the American Society's bone marrow transplant guidelines, and no guidelines suggest routine testing of the staff. So, how do we start? The first question when somebody says I've come into contact with a COVID positive person, whether it's a patient, a visitor, or another healthcare personnel. So the first question is, was there prolonged contact? What does prolonged contact mean? Now that's a difficult question to answer. There is no cutoff beyond which it's absolutely dangerous, and there is no minimal contact which is absolutely safe. The Singapore document, if you look at it, they say less than 10 minutes is probably not a concern and they're not going to be worried about it. And more than 30 minutes is probably significant. WHO kind of splits it and says 15 minutes. So exact duration is unknown. So for the sake of, making life easier for all of us, we say about 15 minutes of direct exposure, continuous exposure is risky. Not 15 minutes in fragmented periods, but 15 minutes of continuous exposure. The second question is about close contact. So the first one is duration. The second question is close contact. What is close contact? Well, again, each document defines it differently. CDC says 6 feet, which roughly converts about 2 meters. WHO and the Indian government, for that matter, use the 1 meter cutoff. I think Singapore also uses the 1 meter. In general, the closer you are, the more riskier it is. So that is important. Remember that physical distance, the more physical distance you have between people, the less likely there is to be a transmission. Next is masking. Is masking being universal? Is it being routine? Is it being strictly followed? So of the mask usage, the first question is always source control. Is the person who is COVID positive wearing a mask? Because the minute the COVID positive person is wearing a mask, the person who is being assessed cannot go into the highest risk category. So between the healthcare provider and the COVID positive patient, it's more important for the COVID positive patient to be wearing a mask. Yes, both should wear a mask, but in terms of risk estimation, more important for the patient to wear the mask. And of course, the question is also whether it was an aerosol generating procedure, because if it is an aerosol generating procedure, the need for the PPE on the recipient side, that is the healthcare provider side, is going to be higher. As far as healthcare workers concerned, was a mask being worn at all time? At least a 3-ply mask. Studies have shown that even a 3-ply mask is pretty good in reducing the risk in routine situations. However, if it is an aerosol generating procedure, you obviously need more personal protective equipment, which includes possibly an N95, definitely eyewear, and possibly a shield, and a few more things. So obviously, if it is an aerosol generating procedure, the requirement for PPE is higher. In other situations, even a simple mask is good. But the most important thing is the patient wearing the mask. What about the source? Is the source infective all the time? Because you may find out much later that the person is infected. So how do you figure it out? Asymptomatics, it becomes very difficult, but in symptomatic patients, always talk to them very, very carefully to find out the exact time of onset of symptoms. It doesn't mean fever, it means onset of the first symptom, which is ascribable to COVID. So generally, studies have suggested that for about 2.3 days, let's say about 2 days, 2 days before the onset of symptoms, the person is infectious, and they tend to remain infectious for 5 days after that. There have been studies both from Hong Kong and from Taiwan where they have said that beyond those 5 days, transmission is most unlikely, and therefore it's probably not a concern. And what does this mean? This also correlates with the fact that when you do viral cultures, forget about the PCR, PCR will show positive. But when you see viral cultures, they really don't culture very well after about 7 days. So it basically means that -2 +5 is the most dangerous time based on the time of onset of symptoms. Of course, this may or may not apply to asymptomatic patients because we don't know what to do with them. So this I've borrowed from the Ram Manohar Lohia website, and this is basically nothing more than the ICMR guideline. So if the source was wearing a mask, if the patient is wearing a mask and is in the infectious period, less than 48 hours or within 5 days of onset, and prolonged exposure of more than 15 minutes and less than 1 meter distance. So you have all of those being ticked off. Then you look at the PPE. If the patient is wearing a PPE, the worst you can do is medium. If you are wearing a reasonable amount of PPE, you go down to the low. So there you really don't need much. You just need self-delegated supervision. I'll come to that in a minute. In medium, of course, you need to go home or you need to go into isolation for 14 days. The problem is going to be when the patient is not wearing a mask. That's a little more concerning. So if the patient is not wearing a mask and the healthcare provider is not wearing a mask or not wearing an appropriate mask, then immediately they go into the high risk category and they need to be isolated. And there's another step of testing. Especially for those people who are involved in things like aerosol generating procedures and all that, you got to be a little more careful, not wearing adequate ones. So you'll go into the medium or the low risk. So for the low risk category, what was suggested? Obviously, every hospital is supposed to have a nodal officer or at least contact the IDSP for your area. Contact them and let them know about it. You can get back to work. Mask use has to be even more strict. A person needs to be counseled and told that it's important that they wear a mask for reducing further exposure. And in the event that they become positive, they shouldn't infect anybody more. It would be a good idea to get their temperature checked twice daily and monitor symptoms on a daily basis. And if they do develop symptoms, they should report immediately. If they are symptomatic, they have to be tested. Otherwise, there is no recommendation for testing at this point of time. For medium and high risk, obviously, again notify, isolate for a 14-day period, meaning they need to be on self-isolation, meaning they need to be in a single room with an attached bathroom and they can't be sharing their utensils and food and things like that. Testing is mandatory if they're symptomatic, obviously. In the high risk category, the recommendation is for a single test now, sometime between day 5 and day 10 to see if they become positive and they're asymptomatic. If all of this are ticked off and there's no problem, then the person can return to work after 14 days. But again, the importance of mask usage and safe behavior in the healthcare setting needs to be reinforced. What medical interventions have been advised? Close contacts should be given HCQS. Well, I would prefer to use the word offered because again, not everybody is comfortable with the use of hydroxychloroquine, and especially with the given recent data that's come out, which is a little muddy, for a period of 7 weeks. In my center, we are not routinely using HCQS. We offer it to everybody, but we don't push HCQS on anybody. And if HCQS is to be used, it would be a good idea to get a baseline ECG and also make sure that they don't have any contraindications to the use of HCQS. The dose would be 400 twice daily or day 1 and then weekly 400 milligrams. Now there's been a caveat saying you can even continue it beyond week 8 because some people ask what to do after 7 weeks. I am not aware of any infectious disease physician using hydroxychloroquine. To my knowledge, none of us are using it because we're not convinced that the data is good enough. Certainly using a multivitamin with some zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D is a good idea because there seems to be some activity with it. It's pretty harmless, it's quite cheap, so really no problem with that, and it's reasonable to consider using that. There are also some other non-allopathic measures which have been recommended in the manual. Since this is an allopathic group, we will stick to that. Those of you who are interested in trying alternative medicine, it's at your own risk. We have no knowledge of that, so I will not be talking about it. What about infectivity? So, like I said, it's important to remember that the time of infectivity is highest before 2 days before and 5 days after. And, I think Dr. Rajesh Mohan will probably talk about this. The importance of cycle threshold now starts becoming important, obvious. And the Singapore group suggests that if the cycle threshold is more than 30 on the PCR, then probably infectivity is practically zero. Why am I saying this? Let's say you test a healthcare provider. The person is a high-risk contact. The person is asymptomatic and has had no problems. And the person's PCR comes back positive. But the cycle threshold is something like 35. What does that mean? It basically, to me, it suggests that this was not the index exposure that the person had, and the person probably acquired infection quite some time back and is probably getting rid of it on their own, or it could be even a false positive. So there are technical issues in this, but so it's good to read up about this, and it's good to be in the know about why cycle threshold may become important in interpreting the infectivity risk. So of course, we know that the government has suggested no repeat PCR. So if a healthcare provider does get infected, they finish their mandatory 14-day quarantine period starting from the day of positivity or from the day of symptoms. And at the end of the 14 days, they do not need to do repeat PCR to prove negativity because many of them may remain positive, but they are non-infected. So how do you do risk mitigation? The last slide. The first thing is about education of all staff. So it's important for staff to understand these processes and know that there's a due process to be followed. So it's about risk mitigation and risk evaluation. There has to be an adequate supply of masks and all other PPEs as is appropriate for their area of use. Avoiding in-person meetings, because even today I see that administrators love sitting together and discussing their business agendas and things like that. So as far as possible, it will be better to have person. And I even see clinicians gathering together to discuss their cases in person. So in-person meetings, as far as possible, is better avoided. Universal mask usage should be encouraged, and this should be top-down. Unless they see the top administrators wearing the mask, it's very difficult. I think it's absolutely important for everybody to wear some form of a mask. If not a 3-ply mask, for the patient visitors and vendors, if they're asymptomatic, at least a cloth mask should be mandatory while on campus. Social distancing and cough etiquette. So even when you're communicating with each other, it's good to remember that 1 meter is a bare minimum. Respect that distance. To me, it's very simple. The way I tell people is, if you lift your arm and if you hit the other person, then that the other person needs to be hit. So make sure that they are at least that much distance away and practice the cough etiquette. Triaging of all patients, visitors, and vendors is a good idea. And I honestly believe that thermal screening routinely for everybody entering the hospital is a good idea, because at least everybody gets their temperature checked at least once a day, because you never know who's going to be having a fever and who could be positive because of the community transmission. There should be a non-punitive way to encourage early reporting and rapid assessment of the risk of infection. And one major issue is about the food and drink break, because people love to sit together in the cafeteria, pull chairs together and discuss cases and things like that. So this is a dangerous place, because by definition in the cafeteria, you really can't wear a mask when you're eating. So you are at a very vulnerable time. And therefore, that is one area where people should be very careful about, because outbreaks can very quickly start from there. I think with that, I will stop my presentation. If there are questions later on, we can discuss.
Thank you, Subra, for encapsulating everything in a nice form. Probably we'll take the questions at the end, and we will go to Dr. Raja Lakshmi's lecture on PPE use. Raji, off to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My topic today is something very basic, but as you all know, that is the only mode of prevention that we have as far as we know for COVID. Still, a vaccine is in place. And my sincere appreciation for SIDS for having done a good job in containing this web series, which is very well received. Can you see my screen now?
You can click on the full screen. Yeah. Slide. Yes.
Can you?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So as we all know that the PPE use is at the maximum now. Not only that, the knowledge of PPE is at its peak now, not only among healthcare workers, but also among the public. So what is lacking is how to choose appropriately, how to wear it, and how to remove and dispose. I am going to tell you in brief in the next few minutes about all the different types of PPE and what is appropriate. We are moving from healing touch towards PPE touch, and that would be the new normal for the several months to come. The components of PPE for COVID include mask, which may be a surgical mask or an N95 mask, face shield or goggles, coverall or gowns, gloves, head cover and shoe cover in special or specific situations. The most important of this component is the mask, which is widely discussed. 3-ply or a 3-layer surgical mask has a filter efficiency of 99% for 3 micron particle size, which should have ISA specifications or equivalent. The outer layer consists of a hydrophobic non-woven layer, which is non-absorbable. That is, it doesn't absorb any fluid or splashes. The middle melt-blown layer acts as a filter. The inner soft absorbent layer is a layer which is transparent, but it absorbs sweat. So the most important layer here is the middle layer, which is melt-blown layer, which absorbs the virus that contains the droplets, droplets that is containing viruses electrostatically, and it cannot infiltrate the mask if the size is more than 3 micron. How to tie? It's very simple. If you take the upper tie over the ear around the head and the lower one below the ear around the neck. But always remember to remove the lower tie first, because if you remove the upper tie, it can fall over your neck and contaminate your neck and torso. Same applies to the ear loop. If you are removing the ear loop, you remove the ear loop from the sides and bending the face forward without touching the front of the mask, which is contaminated. What are the don'ts? Don't wear a mask if it's wet or soiled. Don't crisscross the ties. Don't leave the mask hanging off one ear or hanging around the ear, which is a very, very common scenario. Don't touch the front of the mask as it is contaminated after use. If you accidentally touch so, do perform hand hygiene. What is the difference between surgical mask and N95 mask? The N95 mask shape allows it that doesn't collapse easily. The edges of the respirator are designed for a very good seal around the nose and mouth. It is labeled as N as it's not resistant to oil, and 95 because on 95% it filters very small particles, which is about 0.3 micron. If properly fitted, it has a better capacity to filter than the surgical mask, and ensure good quality standards, which is NIOSH certified N95 or European Union standard as FFP2 or equivalent. How to don a mask? Choose appropriate size and type of N95 mask, which should give a good fit. Hold the mask in your dominant hand as shown here, with the straps hanging freely. Take it to your face and snugly fit over the nose and mouth. Take the lower strap first and across the head, below the ear, and then the upper strap. Make sure that your nose and mouth are completely covered with a good seal by adjusting the nose bridge and the straps. But the most important thing that follows is seal check. Perform a seal check or leak test each time it is worn and before entering the patient area. How is it done? So if you keep your hands over the mask gently and inhale briskly and deeply, a mild inward movement will be noted, which is normal. Also, you try to keep your fingers across the edges of the mask and try to exhale slowly. If you find any leak, then you have to adjust your nose bridge as well as the strap to get a tight seal again. If you don't get a good seal, change the mask for a better fit. Doffing the mask is much more important. Remove the N95 mask by stooping forward and pulling the lower strap first and allow it to hang, then the upper strap, and discard the mask holding the straps. Does use of N95 respirator require fit test beyond ensuring a good seal, which you usually do after each donning and before entering the patient area? N95 should be fit tested in order to demonstrate a good seal, and OSHA recommends it. And this is important to identify what is the correct model and size and fit for that user. And there are several methods, qualitative and quantitative fit test. But IDSA has mentioned that in crisis situation, however, a respirator that has the best facial fit without actual fit testing can be used. Because, moreover, in this scenario, we get a lot of different types and shapes of respirator. And if you don't get a same supply with same fit, you won't have a same respirator each time the user uses. So it is better that they perform a facial fit each time after donning before entering the patient area. What are the don'ts in N95? If you see any of this valve, like a valve with a valve, a mask with a valve, which allows you to exhale, this should be used only in areas where there is construction activities and otherwise, but not in healthcare settings or in public. This allows the user to inhale easily, but he is exposing others all around him at risk because it doesn't filter the exhale air. Other important no is facial hair. If you have a facial hair like a beard or a mustache which interferes with the fit of the mask, then I think you'll have to go away, you have to sacrifice, and you have to switch to a different hairstyle so that you have a good fit, because you cannot compromise wearing an N95 without an appropriate fit. What is PAPR? PAPR is never talked more widely than in this scenario. And this is powered air purifying respirator. PAPR may be selected for use if the N95 respirator choices does not fit or not available, or the employee has a facial hair or a facial deformity that will interfere with the mask to face seal. Another important indication if the person is using the N95 mask for a longer period, a long surgery as an OT, and feeling very uncomfortable, then they can go for a PAPR. So it provides additional comfort and visibility. What happens is there is a blower which blows the air, which is battery run, and there is an HEPA filter which then delivers through the face piece through this hose the fresh air, which is filter. So this doesn't require a fit testing, but it's very expensive. So you won't be having a lot of, you cannot afford a lot of PAPR in your healthcare unit, and more than a couple of scenarios, you won't be using it also. Coming to face shield, it is a very, very cheap and important and reusable PPE, which it's widely used. It's in OP, IP, and also in aerosol generating procedure. It protects the mask from contamination, and also it prevents the user from touching the mask very frequently. It is easily disinfected. You can have a policy, either disinfection by soap and water at the end of the day, or alcohol or bleach disinfection. Goggles serve a similar purpose as face shield. It is for eye protection. It is transparent. It can be worn over corrective glasses also. And the disinfection process is similar to face shield. It is reusable. But when you remove, make sure that you hold only the side to remove it and don't touch the front of the glasses. What is nitride gloves? Nitride gloves has replaced latex gloves for patient care activities in COVID because these nitride lights are resistant to disinfectants such as chlorine. And it's usually non-powdered gloves, which is preferred, non-sterile. It needs to be only a clean glove, but it should have a longer sleeve to cover up to mid-forearm so that there is no gap between the gown and the gloves. IDSA doesn't recommend double gloving. There is no recommendation for double gloving as compared to single gloves. Removing the gloves. These are the steps which is very, very important when you doff the glove because it is it is contaminated. So how do you doff the glove? You pinch or pull the glove at the cuff and remove the glove just like peeling off and hold the glove in the gloved hand. The second glove is removed by putting the fingers, sliding the fingers underneath the cuff, and then again peel off, rolling the first glove inside the second glove and dispose it safely. What is the do's and don'ts of gloves? Always perform hand hygiene even if you are wearing glove. It doesn't substitute hand hygiene. Gloves doesn't substitute hand hygiene. Perform hand hygiene before and after removal of gloves, before wearing gloves and after removal of gloves, and in between each step of doffing, in between patients and after touching patient objects. This is very, very important. If it is Gloves is worn widely in outpatient department. Don't carry hands near the face to avoid contamination. Coverall or the gowns are designed to protect the torso from exposure to virus and contaminated body fluids, so it should be impermeable. It should be preferably light color so that you can detect possible contamination. Gowns are deemed equally acceptable as to coverall as per the IDSA recommendation. Gowns are considered easy to put on and for removal as well, especially in OT setting. If you have a thumb loop, it is ideal because it will anchor your sleeve so that there is no gap between the gloves and the gown when worn. Secure the gown if it is worn at neck and waist so that there is no gap in the back. Wear the first glove under the sleeve if 2 gloves are worn, and the second glove should be over the sleeve. When you remove, always roll it inside out to prevent contamination all around, and put in appropriate bin. Don't pull or roll over the sleeves after you wear the gown. Don't allow contaminated gowns to hang out of the garbage and contaminate the corridor. And you should doff the gown in appropriate area like doffing area. Head covers are used if gowns are used to cover the head if aerosol generating procedures are done, and hair should fit inside the head cover when worn. Shoe covers is worn up to cuff along with gown or maybe a part of coverall. But IDSA guideline panel makes no recommendation for the use of shoe covers, but it would be preferable if you're going into an aerosol generating procedure where you can have splashes and you can contaminate your shoes. So these are steps of donning and doffing, which I won't be going into detail, but this will be made available in your website through a video. And perform hand hygiene. First would be gloves, coverall, followed by shoe cover, N95 mask, hood, face shield, second gloves, and make sure that there is no skin exposed before you approach the area of patient care area. If coverall is worn, there won't be a separate hood. Doffing is again, these are the steps, but the most important difference is hand hygiene between each step. To decontaminate your gloves is very important. Shoe cover followed by outer gloves, face shield, coverall, N95 mask, and perform hand hygiene, check for contamination before you exit. So coming to the most important topic, the N95 mask, when and why to reuse. If you have a conventional capacity where your inflow of patient is okay and you have enough number of masks, you will call that as a conventional capacity where you can overcome the shortage. What we are facing is contingency capacity and crisis capacity. So if you find that the N95 mask is temporarily not available, what you can switch to is wait and reuse. And in crisis capacity, what you do is FFR decontamination. So IDSA also reiterates that in contingency and crisis capacity, it is better to wear a face shield or a surgical mask to cover the N95 respirator for it to allow for extended use as part of appropriate treatment. That means you will prevent contamination of the N95 mask by wearing a face shield. So what is wait and reuse method? Research indicates that virus survives, SARS-CoV virus survives up to 72 hours on a variety of surfaces, including mask. Therefore, one method is wait and reuse. So if you can issue 5 respirators to a healthcare worker who can take care of that mask and store it properly, you can follow this method. What is done is the mask should be ideally correctly labeled and the number of uses should be marked and the department should be marked as well so that there is no mismatch. And he actually stores this mask in his cabin. He takes care of the mask. So the mask cover, the cover should also be labeled correctly with date of first worn date and as well as the follow-up dates when it is worn again. And it follows so that he can use it for 4 times or so till it is damaged. So you'll have additional supplies of 4 other masks, which is again stored in the rebreathable cover like this. On March 29, 2020, US FDA issued emergency use authorization for decontamination process of N95 mask. So what they have shown is potential modes of decontamination FFR were vaporous hydrogen peroxide, UV germicidal irradiation, and moist heat. And Sterard was the first method and machine approved for this vaporous hydrogen peroxide disinfection of N95 mask. And they have selected some compatible N95 respirator, which should not contain cellulose-based materials. Coming to UVGI, the ultraviolet irradiation has demonstrated to inactivate human respiratory viruses on various models of N95 FFRs. So the level of UVGI that is needed to inactivate these respiratory viruses is well below, the required level is well below the irradiation, and which will adversely affect the fit and filtration of the N95 mask. So this is the idea behind UVGI, and it can be safely administered if you have appropriate policy in place. So this is what we do in our setup. We have a UVGI room, and it is the mask, used mask are hung, appropriately labeled mask are hung when adequate time and of exposure is given. And then the mask should have the same label as we showed for the reuse type. And the operator sits outside to operate the UV, and you have a log to know from where you receive and dispatch. And you should have a container to hold the mask before disinfection, and after disinfection, you put in a fresh cover which is labeled and sent to the appropriate areas. Before using a reused decontaminated mask, ensure that your integrity of the mask is okay, the straps and nose bridge are okay, they didn't degrade, and you should have a good seal check before entering the area. If you feel that the mask is compromised, discard the mask and get a fresh mask. To summarize, if you look at the IVSA guideline, what do you need? What are the PPE you need if you go into a COVID care area? What is appropriate PPE is gowns, gloves, eye protection, and a mask. What sort of mask do you need in conventional setting? If there is no aerosol generating procedure, what you need is a surgical mask or an N95 mask, depending on the time you spend and the procedure or the type of patient you have. If you are doing an aerosol generating procedure, what you need is an N95 mask. So what is different in contingency and crisis setting is reprocessed N95 mask. For aerosol generating procedure, what is advised is to have a face shield or a surgical mask over the N95 mask to allow extended use and to avoid contamination or splashes occurring over the N95 mask. If you want to have a detailed idea about how and what to wear, what type of PPE to be worn in different areas, you can have a look at this Ministry of Health guidelines, which is released one in March and second one in May. As these are detailed, we had a detailed discussion on all these topics by Dr. V.R. Ramasubramanian sir in previous sessions. So to sum up, if you are in the OP and there is no aerosol generating procedure, this would be the ideal, a surgical mask with a face shield. If you are in the OP clinic, again, there is no, but there is aerosol generating procedure. Or if you are going into a COVID care area, but you're not going to do a detailed examination or an aerosol generating procedure, that would be sufficient, which includes a face shield, a N95 mask, apron, and a glove. If you're going to a COVID area where you expect an aerosol generating procedure, intubation, ICU, all those areas, you wear a complete coverall, which an N95 mask and a goggles or a face shield. PAPR is for those who are doing an aerosol generating procedure who can afford, but it is not sustainable. If you can't wear an N95 mask for some reasons and you need a good fit and you are going into an aerosol generating procedure area or you are going to do it, then you can go for a PAPR. But you should have a PAPR maintenance program in your setting, because the handling and how to disinfect, all policy should be there in place if you are going to select a PAPR for your use. So I will end my slide with this. Let us be responsible not only in choosing the correct PPE, but also disposing, because this is going to be our next problem. Thank you all.
Hello, may I start?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'll do my. Sorry. Some problem. What has gone wrong? No.
Click on the share screen button.
Yeah, I'll do that. Please tell me, is it seen?
You can now click on the full screen. Yes.
Is it seen?
It will come up. It will take just 5 seconds. Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Friends, good afternoon. And once again, thanks to SIDS for this opportunity. We had discussed this topic of diagnostics in COVID-19 on 13th April. And today we are here again to discuss some updates in diagnostics. We'll also, in the passing, also discuss some updates in our understanding of what has happened all this during this time, and how these two updates, diagnostics and our understanding, how do they fit together. I'd certainly like to acknowledge the help of Amina, Anjali, and Sampada, the microbiologists who helped me in the preparation. And we now need to have a little difference in our approach. For example, what's the role of diagnostics in our current predicament? Because now we are here to ease the lockdown. And if you look at what is happening here, is there are countries like United States who have already passed their peak, and certainly China, which has definitely passed their peak. And if you look at India, although our ascent is slow, it is still on an ascending curve. We've still not reached the peak. And therefore, we'll now have to think how to use our diagnostics for both these to suit these current conditions. So I'm sure you're aware of all this, and Subra told us just now that the period of infectiousness comes about 2 days prior to the onset of symptoms. The person maybe 1 day later is at the peak of infectious virus shedding, and then everything reduces at day 8 or day 10. So this is the period which is most infectious. And after that, there is this positive long tail of PCR positivity. And you may, these dotted lines tell you that PCR may sometimes be intermittently positive. Okay, so there is so much of a difficulty in assessing what this PCR really means. I would even go on to say that this is like mistaking the shed skin of a snake for the snake itself. Okay, so the main damage is coming somewhere here. Later on, the PCR, the nucleic acid, continues to remain amplified. It's a long, long tail which keeps wagging, but should not deter us from going ahead. Okay, and that's why now we are sort of veered to this concept that we should use a time-based or a symptom-based termination of isolation rather than demonstrating 2 negative PCRs and so on. And if you look at the antibodies, see what is happening. In most cases, the antibodies are rising faster. In milder cases, they are coming up later. And really speaking, somebody who's asymptomatic, who's only had a presumed infection so many days ago, may be coming much, much later. So these are the important things we need to understand. So there are the kinetics of these antibodies, the types of antibodies, IgM, IgG, both, and so on, and the functional characteristics of these antibodies, namely whether they are neutralizing or only the ones which are used for detection. All these 3 things probably depend upon the viral load of the patient as well as the patient profile. So what are the current challenges in our understanding? One is we need to validate some of these new tests. We are probably now exploring additional specimen types and collection methods. Also, how do we decide who should be tested? And this is becoming more and more important because now we are in this phase. What are the updates in PCR testing, serology testing, and what is the significance of all this? And I'll just finish with what tests may be coming soon. So any new test has to undergo a rigorous approval process. It needs clinical studies to demonstrate adequate performance against a reference or a gold standard. Alas, we don't have a gold standard for this particular disease. Emergency use authorization needs only adequate analytical sensitivity of the test and specificity, and usually this is done through contrived specimens, which actually differs from what is clinical sensitivity of testing actual patients with disease, clinical sensitivity, specificity, and finally, depending upon the pre-test likelihood or the prevalence of the disease, what is the positive and negative predictive value of the test. Now, viral load is also not constant in the same individual, and it likely varies with the clinical profile and perhaps also with the specimen types. And we just have heard just now that the CT value can be a surrogate marker for the viral load. So what should be the limit of detection of the test? If we keep it too low, then there might be false positives. If we keep it too high, there might be false negatives. So all these are difficult issues, and different tests will have different performance characteristics. Looking at new specimens, all along we've been talking about nasopharyngeal swabs and oropharyngeal swabs, but middle turbinate swabs, even self-collected swabs, gargle samples, and in patients who have a ability to give the lower respiratory sample, and perhaps even saliva and other samples are being looked at. The next question is who to test. So if you see the map of India and which shows you these number of laboratories which will do the RT-PCR for us, you think that the whole map is covered. On the other hand, if I just reduce the size of each of these icons, you will find that many more can be accommodated. In other words, I don't think that we have plenty of testing facilities, and therefore we'll have to prioritize whom to test. Okay, and this is what comes from the ICMR. Very briefly, symptomatic patients are the ones which they urge us to test. So obviously this international travel history, returnees, migrants, contacts of confirmed cases, those are severe respiratory symptoms, those are hospitalized and then develop symptoms, frontline healthcare workers. And then there is a small group of asymptomatic high-risk contacts of confirmed cases. So if we don't have enough facilities for testing, then we should be testing these people. On the other hand, is it enough? If you ask yourself the question, enough, then probably no. And we should also have a conceptual framework as to who should we test. Because we don't have adequate facilities, we might only elect to test those people with symptoms. But please let me tell you that relying solely on symptoms leads to both underdiagnosis as well as overdiagnosis. So if you're underdiagnosed, obviously the person will continue about and spreading infection about. On the other hand, there is a problem with overdiagnosis. So in fact, you might be missing some other treatable cause. The person may be unnecessarily be treated with, maybe isolated unnecessarily, maybe treated with drugs which are more toxic, which do not have any proven benefit. And at the end of it, when he recovers, he may think that I have already suffered from this disease and may actually not take any more precautions. So there are problems of both under and over diagnosis. And this is the algorithm of for whom to test from IDSA. And basically, it is not really meant to supplant the clinical judgment. And whether and the extent to which we should be following this guideline is entirely voluntary. Let's take a part of this algorithm. So here you have a patient who's an individual who is symptomatic. So if the suspicion for this disease is high, or if he is hospitalized. So these are the two main reasons why we might really insist on testing. And if the test turns out to be negative, we may still want to repeat the test. Because the test positivity of PCR, and this we discussed this in our last session, depends on the illness duration and the sample size. You know, the test sensitivity is 70% at best and much lesser when you go along the illness. The repeat test will have to be done because if the patient is already admitted, more than 2% misdiagnosis is perhaps considered as unacceptable. Let's move to the next part of the algorithm. So if you have a suspicion which is low, and if the test is negative, then the advice is do not do repeat testing. Believe the negative predictive value of that particular test. However, this NPV will depend upon the epidemiological setting from where the patient is coming. Now, if the prevalence in that particular locality is low, then this negative test will have a high negative predictive value, and obviously no repeat testing is needed. However, the true prevalence is estimated only if we can be sure that we are doing adequate testing. And what do I mean by adequate testing? It has to have low number of persons with a positive test divided by the number of tests that are conducted. Remember, these are low number of persons with a positive test, not low number of positive tests. Now, data released in our country since April 25 is only about the total number of tests conducted, and therefore there might be some potential problems like non-use of the unique ID for the patient for subsequent tests. Then we move to a little more difficult area, and that is of asymptomatic individuals. So IDSA as well as ICMR and would want us to test asymptomatic individuals if they are exposed and if testing is available. If there is a immunosuppressive procedure, so the person is going to receive chemotherapy or something like that, or there is major time-sensitive surgery or time-sensitive aerosol generating procedure, interestingly, where PPE is limited and testing is available. So it is recommended that you would test if the patient is being hospitalized and if the patient is from a hotspot with more than 10% prevalence. On the other hand, if the person is from an area which is having less than 2% prevalence, then testing is not needed based on the philosophy that we would consider 2% missed cases in the hospital as acceptable. However, again, to remind you that the true prevalence may be underestimated. And this threshold is only an expert opinion, or it's a philosophy. It's based on opinion regarding the risk tolerance as well as the phase of the epidemic. For example, if you have more and more people who are already infected, perhaps immune, then it is acceptable to not to test those patients who are asymptomatic. We now move on to some of the new tests. We already discussed about PCR last time. So there are now some rapid PCRs or rapid nucleic acid amplification tests. So these are self-enclosed systems which integrate the nucleic acid extraction, amplification, and detection. And I had discussed Expert Express SARS-CoV. This is the Expert platform, but there is also one indigenous platform called TrueNat. And if you look at the basic cost of TrueNat, it is much less. And so has been validated by ICMR, and the availability of the kit as well as the machine is relatively easy. Now, how good are these rapid NATs as compared to standard PCR? IDSA was confused about it, and IDSA guideline panel could make no recommendation for or against using the rapid testing method versus standard RNA testing. So this is where we stand now. Now, additionally, there is new technology. One of this is called as CRISPR, which is called as clustered regularly interspersed short palindromic repeats. So basically, this is also a RNA, also a molecular technology where you use a different type of enzyme which can efficiently amplify DNA from a single molecule to at a low isothermal state with no need to break the double-stranded structure of DNA. What I understand from all this is that the results are available in less than 1 hour. And there are two platforms by which this is done. They are nicely called as Sherlock and Detector system. The next method, which might be helpful perhaps, is pool testing. So to introduce this method is that the swab is dipped in one and then 3 or 4 swabs are dipped in the other viral transport medium. So this augments testing capacity without really loss of sensitivity. So pools up to 3-4, but at least in this particular publication, even up to 64 may be attainable, but they will require additional amplifying cycles. And if anything comes positive in that pool of 5 or maybe higher number, then subsequent individual testing is to be done if anything comes positive there. Now, where might this be useful? It might be useful if the prevalence is low or if the exposed group is a cohesive group. For example, it is hospital staff. So you have one patient and you have about, say, 20 people who have been exposed to that patient. Or one person in a particular factory shift tests positive. So you can do that. Army units and so on. Still, extensive validation of this method has not yet been done. So that really needs to be done before it can be more widely adopted. What does the ICMR tell us about this pool testing? Maybe we can use it in areas of low prevalence, such as less than 2%, but I am unable to find out what is the prevalence at different parts of our country and in the containment zones. So I cannot really translate that into any particular figure. In areas of prevalence such as 2 to 5% for community surveillance, but they say that you should exclude testing of contacts of confirmed cases. So I'm really not able to understand this particular thing. It should not be done if the prevalence is high, such as more than 5%. And according to ICMR, you should not be pulling more than 5 samples in a pool. Let's now turn to serology. So again, I'm reminding you that serology is certainly not meant for diagnosis of acute infection. We saw the chart where the antibody response comes up much later, say maybe about 10-15 days after the infection has occurred. So we can't really use it for making a diagnosis of acute infection. It measures the host response, the IgM-IgG response, by detecting the antibody which is bound to the viral proteins, and different methods are there for measuring the thing, including the lateral flow assay. Now in this, I wish to compare what does serology do, what is different from PCR. Okay, so obviously this is a blood sample which we take, so there is no hazard in collecting the sample and so on, less expensive. The turnaround time is also lesser. Its sensitivity may go up to 95% after 14 days, but all this depends upon the kinetics of the antibody, selection of the time of the test, and the adopted cutoff value. Is it specific? Now, at least in this publication, they said it is really specific because a double sandwich method is really relatively specific for SARS-CoV-2, and therefore previous infections with other coronaviruses may not cross-react. There isn't any particular advantage of IgM, IgG versus combo, and therefore any type of antibody is okay. But what is important is here that a positive predictive value of a test is heavily dependent upon the prevalence. And that is improved by testing. If you get a positive test, you can possibly repeat the test with another different antigen or a format of testing. Very similar to how we would like to do or repeat a test for HIV. Now we know that antibodies to the N protein has a high avidity but low specificity. On the other hand, the antibody to the receptor binding domain of the spike protein is likely to be protective. So we can still do a good amount of fine tuning of this test, and that is for a little more for the future. So these fine tuning of tests is needed for different purposes, like for detection, for possible antibody dependent enhancement, and also for assessing protection of the patient. Let's look at the kinetics of PCR and serology, quantitation, and is there any pathogenetic correlation? Now the viral load, and as Subra said, that as well as the viability varies inversely with the CT value. So this is a good handle on to viral load and viability. The high viral load, which would occur because of increased expression of these two receptors, and these two happen to be senescence markers. So not surprising at all that these are overexpressed in elderly people, and therefore they have higher viral loads. Now, what does the high viral load produce? It produces a strong external follicular B cell response and lots of antibodies. These might increase the uptake of the virion antibody complex via the Fc receptor. So this is the ADE which we are talking about. On the other hand, a lower viral load actually produces a gradual development of the antibody, which will occur because of B cells, which are at the germinal centers. They undergo somatic hypermutation, as well as the antibody undergoes affinity maturing, leading to a protective IgG immunity. Now, where will we use the PCR? In a patient with symptoms or in an asymptomatic individual to confirm, but it can only help if it is positive when it can confirm the diagnosis. A negative test does not exclude the diagnosis and doesn't give all clear. What about the use of serology? In a patient with symptoms and suppose he has negative PCR, then a positive antibody, which we might be doing later on, increases the diagnostic certainty and is complementary to PCR. So I think the role of this antibody testing is somewhat complementary for an individual patient, complementary to PCR. On the other hand, if you're using it for epidemiological purpose, then there are these additional uses of the antibody or serology. So that will tell us epidemiological variables such as the attack rate, case fatality, community transmission, effect of vaccine candidates, use of plasma for therapy, and perhaps deploying the healthcare workers and to release them from containment zones. It's not an accident, friends, that the antibody test has been called as a COVID kavach. Kavach means an armor. Okay, so it tends to suggest that you are having a protective armor because you already have an antibody. I think it is a little bit too soon to make that conclusion, but I hope that's right. Now, which are the tests which may be coming soon? So one of them is viral load measurement, and the surrogate for that can be the CT value, but viral measurement or viral load measurement may be useful. There may be tests for assessing whether the antibody that you have is neutralizing to the virus or not. And finally, you have other tests such as plaque reduction and pseudovirus neutralizing assays. So what does lie ahead of these diagnostics? New tests will certainly be devised, maybe with better performance characteristics, high throughput, and less cost. And if all this is there, then we can expand the amount of testing that we can do. We can enable better utilization of our capabilities if we have better testing. And perhaps these tests can also be used for devising clinical trials. After all, you can use viral load as a surrogate marker for the efficacy of the drug and so on. There are many, many knowledge gaps at the present moment, but the precise meaning of the test and these knowledge gaps will have to be filled, and that will help us to refine clinical decision making. It will enable fine tuning of the tests because we need to know which test to do, at what stage in the patient's illness, for which patient or individual, and for what purpose. With this, I'll stop, and I'll end with the thought that all this that we say is going to hold true only for the next few days. This field is moving very, very rapidly. Something as fresh as this already has cobwebs here and fungus here and so on. So it's just becoming dated within no time. With this, I'll stop and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Soman, for an excellent lecture covering all the advances in the field of COVID diagnostics. I think as we were running a little late, I think all of the other panelists have answered questions, whatever that has come. Probably, I think with that, we will come to the end of the session. But one little announcement that I want to make is Dr. Rajalakshmi and her team at KIMS had prepared a video on PPE donning and doffing. Probably we would upload that video in the SIDS website in a couple of days, and that would be much useful because lectures are always fine, but when you see as a video, you will know that the practical difficulties in handling the PPE. So that is one area that we've never been trained as a student in our undergraduate and postgraduate. I thank Dr. Raji and her team at KIMS Trivandrum for preparing that video. Thank Dr. Rajiv Soman, thank Dr. Subramaniam Swaminathan for that excellent lecture. With that, we would be coming to an end of the SIDS COVID webinar series part 3, and I still do not know what is lying ahead. I'm not sure. Probably India is going through the pandemic phase, and probably with more requests in terms of further information. We would like to come up with a different version, probably with every single edition. We have done it in a different way, in a different style. Probably another 2-3 weeks, depending upon the request that we have from physicians and our society members, we would come up with something on COVID or something else in terms of antimicrobial resistance, infection control, whatever it is, depending upon the audience pulse. That is something that we are planning up as a regular educational activity in terms of webinar. I think whatever COVID has done, what has made us realize is we could connect to people through easy means. It's not about having only conferences. Probably such webinars are much easier ways to communicate with people, and all the lectures for the part 1, part 2, part 3 are available in our SIDS website, www.sidsindia.org, and all the websites are uploaded, all the lectures are uploaded in the YouTube channel, and all people have to type is CIDS, SIDS, which stands for Clinical Infectious Disease Society, SIDS webinar, and you would have access to all the lectures that we have done. And once again, thank you, all the viewers. I thank the speakers, Dr. Rajiv Soman, Dr. Subramaniam Swaminathan, and Dr. Rajalakshmi for sparing their time and sharing their expertise with respect to the relevant topics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.